How is a shirt actually made? Take a look with me behind the scenes of the Italian Oxford button-down shirt that is currently under development, and you'll get an understanding of why this process takes some time and also the steps that are necessary to produce a product. First, you start off with a shrink test because despite what the supplier might tell you, you still have to double check that the shrink rate that they're providing you with is accurate, and that's why measurements are taken of the fabric before and after the washing process, and then they're compared against each other, and then you should start making your size chart and tag back for this particular fabric. The pattern pieces are then laid out in digital form. You often also have CAD files that go along with this, and then they're passed on to a printer, which you will see in a second, because cutting it from a paper pattern is still the most prestigious or luxurious way, depending on how you want to look at it, in order to cut the fabric by hand. So whenever you're seeing cucita a mano or hand cuts, this usually means that there's been a paper pattern that's been printed and then cut, and that's the reference that the cutters then use in order to adjust the fabric panels. And that's the little Chekhov's gun moment here, and why you're seeing that little scissor that we had in the beginning shots here again, because that's then used to cut the fabric and the paper panels. And once this is all done and the panels have been cut, you go on to the actual processing and sewing. Here we have some interlining that's getting fused to a fabric panel. And in case you're wondering why there are only single pieces that go through all of the machines, is because we documented this for illustration purposes. So it's better to understand the individual work steps, and it's also much easier to follow when you don't see a stack of fabric panels laying on top of each other. That's why this process also looks a lot more laborious than it actually is when you get into final production, because then everything is standardized. You don't need a single person cutting a single panel, but everything is done in batches and at much higher scale. And before we move on to the next step, which is one that is going to be repeated over and over again throughout the production process, because it is one that is often overlooked and also not shown because it is not as prestigious as the hand cutting and sort of slow motion, it is the ironing. There is an ironing step after each and every single workstation. And this applies to every single piece that gets sewn onto the fabric, whether it's the locker loop that's getting folded over and ironed here, as well as the chest pocket for the Oxford cloth button-down shirt. And you can see how laborious this is when you do this for every single panel and piece. And while there's a lot of prestige in hand cutting, the ironing is really the work and labor intense part of the shirt making process, even if it doesn't require as much training as operating a sewing machine with a very high stitch density. At least that's what we're aiming for at the current stage of the prototyping process. And so while each step is set up for a workstation, meaning that a single employee repeats a step over and over again, they all take time to execute, especially if you want them to be executed well and with a lot of detail. Which harks back to the shirt ranking that started this entire journey here, because the more work steps there are required in order to make a garment, the more expensive it gets. Yes, fabric is also a big cost center when you're producing fashion, but judging a garment solely by the fabric that was used for it only tells half of the story, especially if you're looking for something that's meant to be durable and last a long time. The cut and sew, as well as the overall garment construction, matters a lot more because it has to withstand a lot of wear and tear and abrasion over time. And that's why we collected so many close-ups, because there are so many steps that go into making just a shirt. When you think about more complex garments like a dress, for example, or outerwear that has many more layers and panels to it, the work obviously adds up and it becomes not only more expensive but also just more laborious and requires different levels of skills to work with different machines as well as different fabrics. And while there is a certain level of quality that you can achieve by simply going through labor arbitrage and producing in a different country, there is a certain price point that will still have to be met. You cannot make really good really cheap. We're past that point. Labor globally and inflation have caught up with everything, which is why there are certain baseline prices that apply to every single product category. You cannot get a good shirt for $50. It doesn't work. even if you produce at scale for a very low price in terms of manufacturing CMT costs, which is why the shirt sheet is meant to give you a guidance of what to look for and what you're willing to trade off for getting a lower price and paying less for a garment. And of course also on the flip side, show you when you're paying a lot for a garment what you're actually getting for it, because not every brand spends a lot on CMT. And now we're moving on to the buttonholes, a fully automated process, unless they're obviously sewn by hand by a nonna somewhere in a back room in Naples or in certain factories as well. And in case you've been wondering why I always point out whether a shirt has a horizontally sewn last buttonhole or not, this alignment will illustrate why it's an actual differentiator, because you cannot simply rotate the fabric by 90 degrees and expect it to turn out a horizontally sewn last buttonhole. Nevertheless, I find this process and automation always very impressive because it is so consistent, and especially in a close-up it looks kind of cool. And the same applies to the button attachment, which is also fully automated because we want to keep this shirt in a fairly attainable price range where you're still getting a lot of quality, including an Escolite button shank seal, which is a thermally sealed button shank that is essentially preventing the button attachment to ever open up or come loose. And once all of the buttons have been thermally sealed with this machine, or at least the button shanks, not the buttons themselves, but you get the point here, we're moving on to some last refinement sewing, as well as of course a visual quality control, but this has not been conducted for this prototype and during the filming of this video, but you get the point. And then the final step that is actually left to do is ironing the entire garment, because now that it's fully assembled, all the panels, all the buttons and all the little nicks and crannies have been filled with, for example, the locker loop. It has to be put and pressed into shape, which is a very thorough process and something that we could probably all learn something from, because the people who do this for a living are very quick at it, and a lot of people who complain about ironing taking so long apparently just lack the practice, and that includes me, who needs about a minute and a half to iron a full shirt. Now, if you have any questions at this point about certain production steps, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments, so feel free to leave a comment below. Now, in case you have noticed it, there's a Wolfers Gold label in here for the prototype. And that's because we're planning to launch this as a collaborative product, and the labels that are made for this were not ready at the time of filming, of course. So stay tuned for the grand reveal of this. Here's the locker loop and the box pleat that will be featured on the OCBD. Some very traditional design elements of an Oxford shirt, even though the locker loop isn't used as much as people claim that they need it as a feature on their OCBDs. That said, I know that this will trigger comments of people absolutely loving and relying on locker loops and would never buy an OCBD if it didn't come with one. And now that you've watched and followed the production and the entire ironing process of a shirt when it goes through this process of prototyping, you get rewarded with it being folded and eventually boxed up, because it needed to make its way to me all the way from Italy to where I was at the time of receiving the package. And as with every prototype, we got close to what we wanted from it, but there are some details that need improvement, and we're currently in the process of making a second one. So by the time this video goes live, it hopefully is already starting production. But nevertheless, you can see the amount of detail and work that goes into a shirt, and that's why certain prices have to be charged. If you want something that's made in Italy under good conditions where everyone's getting paid well and can afford to take Ferie Agosto, meaning the almost entire month of August off, that obviously depends on the factory and the time, whether that is a 2 or 4 week break. But I'm very happy to be working with Mauro from Wolfers Gold on this project and bring you a really well-made Italian Oxford cloth button-down shirt that's gonna last for a very long time. It addresses a lot of the points that we didn't like about what's currently in the market. So stay tuned and sign up if you are interested in this shirt.